And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, for the big one. Episode 13 of Myth and Meaning, the show in which your hosts on the left, Owl,
And your host on the right, Brok.
dissect the mythological nature of fictional works. And in this episode, we're going to be tying together a lot of the ideas from Season 1 of Dragon Ball. As you can see, the title is a reference to the attempted recreation of this saga, I suppose you could say, or this season, in movie format from the animation studios behind Dragon Ball. And in this picture here, we can see kind of a piercing of that eternal veil. But I'm going to go ahead because I think Brock has some more things to say about this on how he found it and the like.
Right, this is a cover for Beyond Good and Evil, I believe, by Nietzsche. And I tried to find the original person to credit with the creation of this artwork and couldn't. It could just be my poor searching skills. But I really like this image because of what this episode's going to ultimately be about, because we're going to be tying in the idea of the unconscious with ancestry, right? So what you can learn from the white dot and the black side of the yin and yang, that wisdom, and that being tied to your ancestry and what you can learn from your biology, so to speak.
Well, right, and you said ancestry and what else?
Your biological makeup, the way that you are sort of created, so to speak.
Your nature and your ancestry.
Yeah, your human nature, right? That 4-star ball.
I would say it's more than that, because behind, and I think displayed in this picture, behind the veil is revealed the inner cosmic clockwork that runs the universe, let's say.
Time.
Not just time. It's not just time. It's all the mechanics therein, and how there seems to be a prescriptive right way to live.
Mm-hmm. A greater pattern, right?
That fits with the rules of the universe and comes into more alignment. That's actually also what I wanted to talk about in this, because you have society here, and it is on the edge of this great cosmic collection, and they're totally unconscious and unaligned with it. And it takes this one artist that's peering through the veil.
Right, and this is going to tie in with what the castle means as an archetype, what Uzeru is going to mean in the piercing of that castle, right? So that's part of why I wanted to use this image, just because there is a clear piercing of the veil in what's going on in this episode. Because even though we're going to be talking about the dragon and the wish, the main theme of what's going on here is beyond that, right? It's about learning something beyond just having confronted the Dragon of Chaos, the eternal Dragon of Chaos.
All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. And we're actually going to start this episode from the tail end of where we were, which last episode, if you remember, we were talking about Boss Rabbit and Bluma's eventual reconciliation with that. She became a carrot. And so she ought to have learned her lesson at this point, would you say, Brock?
Yeah, I think that being turned into a carrot and then being given back your personhood would typically make you appreciate and maybe respect that reality that you're in, that you've been given, that autonomy, right?
So here, I think what happened, they're driving along to find the next Dragon Ball, which is the last Dragon Ball, by the way. It's the one that Pilaf has. And she makes them swerve because she makes Oolong go to the bathroom using her piggy manipulation, which we've obviously ascribed to the thoughterry and the ability for women to control men, and the abuse of that is what turns women into spinsters like the one we see on the right here. And so Oolong points that out to her and is kind of saying, you're making the wrong choices in this situation by saying nobody's ever going to marry you.
Right. I mean, he's basically calling out the fact that she has not learned a lesson from essentially what she just went through, right? I mean, he didn't stick around and defend her or anything, but Oolong still recognizes like you know, you did not respect the encounter that you had, right? Like there's a wisdom that you didn't get from it. And so he's sitting here telling her like, you're still not on your path, which her, you know, she has said that her wish would be to have a handsome boyfriend, right? So he's just like, you can't have your wish.
And I also I want to point out too that that stalk in the background is not a tree, because Toriyama has clearly illustrated at this point that this is the time to grow. It's almost it's kind of it's interesting. I want to compare it to Dark Souls level design, let's say. Because Dark Souls level design makes it to where the upgrades and equipment that you need is where you need it to be. So, for example, if anyone knows, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but I'll make it quick. In Sen's Fortress, you get a lot of large Titanite chunks, or large Titanite shards. That's because you really need a +10 weapon to deal with the enemies in that area. It's the same thing here. Toriyama has set up his characters. They need to confront, let's say, parts of themselves. And so they're in a mushroom forest.
Well, a mushroom desert, right? It's this sort of like huge collection of mushrooms towering up over the desert that they're basically like trees. And so we have this. I want to talk first about our top left picture here and a little bit about the stoned ape theory, right? Where we had described this season as sort of being a genesis of Dragon Ball. And this kind of ties into that idea where the main theme running throughout this is sort of consciousness, like pointing towards, you know, the acceptance of the knowledge of good and evil, so on and so forth, being a bigger thematic thing. And we're seeing here that it's all coming together in this episode. So I love the stoned ape theory and this idea that through fungal intelligence, through eating psilocybin and similar mushrooms, that at a certain state in our evolution, we forced our brains to grow dramatically fast and became hyper aware of patterns and of ourselves because of our consumption of these mushrooms. So,
well, it actually scientifically as well, the consumption of these substances induces the creation of new neural patterns, which decay over time, but if able to be harnessed, could lead to significant breakthroughs in science. They're studying it as we speak. We're not scientists at all.
Yeah,
Both of us are total laymen in that regard.
well, I do want to point out, you know, I've started listening to, I'm not even that far into, The Master and His Emissary. So Ian McGilchrist talking about the hemispheric roles of the brain and those pathways and creating those new neural pathways of communication between the conscious and unconscious, or you could say left and right brain, is people find that to be extremely meaningful, right? And so that's kind of tied into this theory that you gain the wisdom from your unconscious mind, and through doing so, you find a deeper level of meaning in life.
Right, and that's actually, I think, what Toriyama has set up here for our characters to experience, and it's pretty blatantly apparent, especially too with the desert, and let's say that's the desert of value, because Bluma has not a leg to stand on at this point. She's lost all, what do I even want to say with regards to Bluma? All.
She's lost a claim to her dignity. She's lost a claim to what she's inherited from society, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm trying to figure out if there's a word to like encapsulate all that. But right, she's lost a lot of her character now. And Yamcha too at this point has become single-mindedly obsessed with this one idea of value. Goku hasn't yet figured out his value structure. Pilaf's value structure, as we will see, is clearly pathological.
It's
But in the
antagonistic.
desert, we're going to be able to see that. And from these fungal bodies, meaning will arise.
Right, and it's sort of to say, too, that you'll find meaning where meaning is needed to be found, right? It's like springing up out of the desert. It's springing up out of the situation that they have a need for meaning in the first place. So it's, sort of that intuition that meaning manifests itself. It's available to you, even in the desert.
If, let's say, if that person has wished upon a star, but we'll get there. So next here we have the castle and I like that picture on top. Is that from Dune?
No, it's actually from concept art for a movie called Guardians of the Galaxy 2. And that is Ego's Palace.
Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting. What do castles guard? They guard treasures. And in this case, Pilaf is guarding a Dragon Ball. Why is there a castle in the desert, Brok?
A castle in the desert is, in some ways, you can look at a castle as an extension of the person who is the king of that castle, right? Like this is an extension of myself as far out as I can put from myself and still identify as myself, right? Like here's the limit of me. And it's the most outermost part of your identity. And so he's planted those roots there in the desert and has essentially said, the fact that I have this big identity I've projected for myself is enough. And I can place that down in the desert of meaning. And I am meaningful inherently, right? I don't have to have earned a kingdom, let's say. And that is the meaning, right? So it's sort of this fool, we've kind of referred to him as this fool antagonist, but it's a very foolish way of being. It's the mode of being that's why it's called Ego's Palace in Guardians of the Galaxy 2. And this is the palace that the character Ego has set up.
I love that we have Ego's Castle in the title as well. I actually didn't know that.
Yeah, it's interesting because that character has isolated himself, right, from everything, and in his isolation has created this like amazing castle, right? And it's this recurring motif. So
interesting. Right, and I think also it is a edifice of Pilaf's ego. In particular, it's where he's had his operations. It's where he's like tortured his subordinates, and it's his place of security and power. And in this instance as well, I do want to mention that it being in the, let's say, the desert in the forest of mushrooms is to say that Pilaf has really rejected all of the wisdom around him and decided to insulate himself.
Right. It's an isolationist sort of technique here where it's just him and the unintegrated aspects of himself. Right. It's a sort of place where he can sit there and torture himself, literally. Those, his natural elements.
Right. And I think, too, it is a significant step in the road to his downfall, which we're going to get to next here. His downfall is going to come from the malice he inflicts. He's already secluded himself, lashing out at the... And that's really what it is for Pilaf, the unacknowledgement of his greatness, right? His quote-unquote greatness. And so his malice will manifest itself in that way. And we see two like characters here who commit rather malicious acts right before they each are bested.
Mm-hmm. They're very much a spirit of malice, but not, you could say it's almost like the chaotic evil in D&D, right? Or neutral evil, but there's not a higher order to this malice. It's very much standing out here without nourishment in the desert, a projection of a fragile ego, a claim to power by whichever authority, right? We also have other pictures of these characters with crowns as well. Their claim to authority.
But we'll get to that.
But yeah, it's that egoistic.
And the let's say the ability or the lack of ability to abandon that and humble and to be humble prevents these characters from really growing to a point where they're no longer foolish. And that's, I mean, Pilaf remains foolish basically the entire. He never really grows past that. But one of those reasons that he has to, and I think we're gonna get to what you wanted to talk about, referencing that Bible verse here,
right?
Talking about Goku's Dragon Ball and how the Dragon Balls are stolen. 5 of them are stolen from the Dragon Crew, but Goku, who kept his, continues to have it, and they go into the castle and it gets taken from them. But I think you wanted to say some words about that.
Yeah, there's the first stealing where Pilaf is not present, right? He sends out Mai and Shu, and they come down and steal the Dragon Balls. They think they steal the Dragon Balls, and of course they have to fail. And they don't get the one that Goku has, right? Which he refers to as his grandpa. It's like a personification. The first time we see Goku, he's trying to speak to his grandfather through this ball, right? And so he's got it tied around his belt, basically just hanging between his legs. And then to get this final ball from them, he has to be lured into the castle and participate in trying to get, the stolen Dragon Balls back. And then he's knocked out with a sleeping gas. And he has to be approached by Pilaf himself so that they can get the ball from Goku. Now, it's not literally he has to be there, but it's important that they don't get it from him unless Pilaf is actually involved with the action of taking it from him, right? That ancestral thing that he has.
So Pilaf must actively denigrate the idea of the, let's say, the sacredness of the 4-star ball.
Right, the sacred inherited wisdom that you have from your ancestry, specifically the grandfather, right? The masculine ancestry and the wisdom of the grandfather or the great father. Yeah.
The super father.
And so I wanted to talk about Genesis 9:22. This is where this is Noah's shame and Canaan's curse, because it says here, but when he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment and placed it across their shoulders, and walking backward, they covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned away so that they did not see their father's nakedness. So this idea that the witnessing of the nakedness of the spirit of the father, right? The seeing it for its more human than metahuman, you could say, or the more earthly than spiritual elements to it, right? To see it in that light is a negative thing, and that's why they could cover him up, but they had to just make sure they didn't personally witness it, right? They didn't see the Father in that light. So there was a spirit of that, and I think this is kind of the transgression of that is partially what's going on here with Pilaf. He also knocks himself out in the process of getting it right. So he knocks Goku out to get it, and then the process knocks him out as well because he's I think so unconscious to that. Right.
That's interesting. And like I said, when we got to this point, we would have a difference of analysis. Now, what I've been thinking, because Goku is ultimately powerless to get out of this situation. When they gas him, they can't do anything. He tries to use the magical words of the Kamehameha wave, which he is barely proficient.
And it's not enough.
It's not enough to pierce the ego's castle. Now, my analysis of Pilaf taking the 4-star ball from him is it's robbing him of his reverence for his earthly ancestry by showing Goku that he is powerless in the face of the ego.
Right. It's basically saying that you have to remain within the confines of the ego as such to be here, and by being here, now I have the claim to that. It's superseded by the ego, right?
Well, and to say that Goku's reverence for his grandfather is tied in with what he learned from him, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, I think, probably tied in with many of, let's say, everyday people's reverence for their ancestors. Let's say grandparents or parents are really what the lessons you've learned from those people. Now, Goku learned martial arts strength, and he can't use that here. The lessons he learned from the paternal are useless, and I think that's part of the reason why it's significant that this is how the 4-star ball is taken from Goku. I don't know if it's so much that Pilaf doesn't respect it. I think it's even a step further than that. I think it's that Pilaf is robbing Goku of his reverence for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, as an antagonistic spirit, right, that he's embodying, then that, one of his tasks would be to undo that for the characters, right? So his taking of the Dragon Ball would be, represented that way, right?
So I think you combine the two analyses.
Yeah, I think that by acting in that way, right, he's able to do that to him.
Mm-hmm. And after they're captured and the Dragon Balls are taken, Pilaf decides to have some fun with our heroes. And much like Sid from Toy Story or a child burning an anthill, the fun he exhibits is very sadistic in nature.
Yeah, this is in the episode The Punishment is Pinball. And that's another one of those episodes, similar to Boss Rabbit, where when you understand what is going on with the episode, it's surprising that you would ever consider something like this filler content. There are several things that are going on inside of the pinball game that he's playing with them. And one of the things is there's the mirrored ball, right? And we'll see that come up. And the playing of music as well. He's doing it by playing music on a keyboard.
It's a perversion, right?
He's literally playing,
which
right?
That is part of what the fool does, is pervert and subvert,
right? And I mean that's why,
or the imp. I should rather say the imp. I think that's a more precise name for what Pilaf is.
The impish nature, right?
Well, I even would classify, let's say, Joffrey or Loki as imps.
Oh, sure.
Archetypally, right?
Imp fiend, right? Loki the fiend.
But yeah, exactly. It's music. It's a perversion. And what does Loki do? Shapeshift. He perverts the spirit of those he shapeshifts into, right?
Right. And as a fool, you could say Oolong does the same thing.
Right. So yeah, I would say the impish nature here is on display.
Mm-hmm.
But right, and I think the whole episode, and I think most of it's an anime only, I believe.
It might be. I don't remember.
They run from the pinball, and eventually it ends up to actually have a pretty decent conclusion here.
Yeah, and it does have a coherent meaning as they go through the pinball challenge, and also the imagery of stars are everywhere throughout the whole pinball sequence. It is much more meaningful than you would think. But too much to talk about on such a broad
We're trying
summary.
To move on to the next thing. Yeah, exactly. So we do see the mirror here, and we see how the pinball would react to Yamcha, let's say. And how can Yamcha resist it, Brok?
Well, it's pretty great because the introduction of the pinball is this great shot I had forgotten about, where we see between his legs and it's coming through the curtains, right?
Yes.
And there's the mirror ball, and the only way that they actually defeat it is that Yamcha stares it down. He faces it, right? He looks at it rather than running away from it. And then, of course, it's a game they're being played with, and the ball backs off, right? And so,
well, also when confronted with and this is what I was trying to say kind of before the show, this is the perversion of play, right? This is not play.
right.
And once a person is cognizant of another's ability to pervert the idea of play, the idea of play can be subverted in its entirety. And it causes people to realize that they could also pervert the idea of play. They could do the same evil which they see in front of them, let's say.
Right. Well, and we've got a representation of, say, narcissists, right? And this propensity, the propensity that you would be enamored with your own, not only ego but your persona, right? And this kind of ties us into that Jungian frame as well, where the persona, right, being the outermost representation of yourself, and also based on your reflection, based on your being aware of your status within, the judgment of society or the father or whatever judgment is going to, right? It's sort of something born out of your ability to be cognizant of that, right? It's almost like a fall, a knowledge of the potential evil for yourself.
It's a precursor as well. The knowledge of good and evil, sure,
Mm-hmm.
is a precursor to being able to harness the chaos inherent in the world and to create from that. And that's what these three pictures are here. Is that idea of the creation that is spawned in the chaos.
Right. The Dragon Balls, being these droplets of chaos and representing the potentiality, right? The potentiality of it is it's one of the easiest things to sort of tie into imagery across a lot of different mediums, because there's always a representation of something that's supposed to represent the totality of chaotic potential itself. What could be, right?
Whether it's the sky or the sea or a dragon, right? Could be a lot of different things.
And then specifically you see it with the Dragon Balls, where the sphere, it's like all of potential is inside of this thing, and it can come out in the form of a dragon, right? So we have a dragon that grants wishes, right?
Because dragons grant wishes.
So he comes up, and the dragon is like a star, right? He blacks out the sky, and then he's this big shining figure that you have to speak to, right? So we're coming back to that idea when you wish upon a star, right? The dragon becomes the star.
Right, and you must not only subordinate, well, let's say our characters have to subordinate themselves to this idea of a greater being, right? A greater spirit, which is the dragon, which is that idea that the spirit of creation is a mightier spirit than many give it credit for, let's say, or many humble themselves to the idea of, perhaps. But right, you have to really, let's say, aim at it and wish for what it is that you want. And that's where we're going to see here the When You Wish Upon a Star song from Pinocchio. We have two illustrations, one benign and one malevolent, of articulated wishes. And it is important to articulate the wish that you're trying to make, because without the articulation, it's never going to happen in the first place.
Right, and specifically in the case of the Eternal Dragon, it's the articulation of that wish in the face of that higher pattern being recognized, right? It's speaking that wish.
It's the magical words, right? It's the idea of speaking order from the chaos, the boundless chaos before you.
Right, I mean, and that idea of the sanctity of free speech, right? The ability to take responsibility for your words. It's speaking something in the face of the chaos of taking
also
responsibility
the
of saying your thoughts,
right? The multitude of that. How able can a person be articulating what it is they wish to happen? Because it is even in the show, a lack of precision in their speech really damns them in their wishes.
That's it's like the genie motif too, where it's the negative aspect of the responsibility of those words, right?
Right. And there is heavy responsibility with that power, and even Pilaf acknowledges it.
Right. So we see here too, a more serious version of what's going on with Pilaf happening with Griffith, right? Where his star in the sky that he's looking up to is that castle, right?
Well, that's because Griffith is no fool.
Right. But that those magic words, he has to say those words to get the thing that he's envisioned, right?
It is.
He does it in an unholy way.
It is in an unholy way, and then we have "There's No Place Like Home," right, which is the chant, the magical chant that's said in The Wizard of Oz after obtaining the ruby slippers. Those are articulations of one's will, and the better a person can be at articulating their will in the world, the more likely the outcomes they will to happen will happen.
Right. I mean, what happens with Dorothy is that she speaks herself back into consciousness, right?
Right. Which is so interesting. It's such a good film.
Yeah.
Got to watch it again. But right, and it is to say that you need to be precise in what you're saying. And here, back while they're making the wish outside, the crew is still in the castle, trapped in the castle.
Mm-hmm.
And Goku is able to make a hole by using the Kamehameha wave and pierce through the castle that is Ego. Now, you got this one on the right from Skyrim, I believe, but I got this one of Adam naming all the animals because that is the power that Goku is, let's say, wielding at the moment. He's able to pierce through and see what's happening and define what's happening, right? And he also allows Oolong and Puar to get out of there. We're going to talk about that in the next slide, but I'll let Brok talk about Skyrim.
It doesn't tie as much into that specific scenario, but, since we are returning to magic words here, after now we've kind of brought up the dragon and how it's representing this potentiality and it's also the antagonistic nature of potentiality. It's the combination. I'm not sure if we've really gotten that much in myth and meaning into this, but it's the combination of sort of the meta predator as such, right? It's a flying snake with claws, and it sort of combines the aspects of, our predators as we develop consciousness. So it's the idea of speaking those words in the face of that is something that you see in Skyrim, where you need to learn the magic words and be able to speak them at the dragons in order to overcome them. And so they're like, it's almost like words of the dragons, right? It's the dragon language. So it's a higher form of language, right? Or a more meaningful form of speaking to inhabit a better change, or more impactful, right? It's a higher tier of speaking.
Before we move on, I do want to ask, though, do you see this correlation, though, between Adam naming the animals here and the taxonomy that we use today?
A correlation between that and the taxonomy. What do you mean by that exactly?
So each species of creature, right, on the planet has a family, a phyla, a genus.
Well, that is what that is, right? The categorization.
We are still
of
embodying
things.
the spirit, right? Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Has it gotten more powerful?
Well,
yes, I would say,
absolutely.
and that is to say that the Kamehameha wave is still used by Goku because its power is limitless. The power of truthful words is limitless.
It's only limited by your ability to conceive of what it is that you're speaking truth to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, the growth of the wave, let's say, is a representation of a growth in Goku's character.
And Goku's character still has a ways to grow. In fact, he can't solve this problem. It has to be another to solve this problem. And we're going to talk about that here. So we're going to talk about how it is Oolong and Puar that first get out. They're the only ones that can fit through the hole Goku has made. Why are they the only ones who can get out of that ego castle, Brok?
I think that the restricting nature of the identity that the castle represents makes it so that you would need to be smaller, insubstantial, a shapeshifter, to be able to navigate it, to get out of it. Now, Goku can see out of it, But Goku is so forthright that as long as I guess the best way I want to put it is as long as he is engaging with Pilaf on the foundation of what the castle is, Goku is not going to break the rules of that engagement. And that has to do with Goku's forthrightness and how he doesn't cheat yet in his development whenever it comes to playing games, right? And we've so you could say the castle is the domain of the interaction of themes here, right? And Goku is not dishonest. He can't engage with that type of thinking yet at all. It's a bigger idea than he's ever had to contend with, right? This is his first encounter really with the ego, like on that scale, right? A serious intersection with the ego.
It's and actually, I think you're on the right track. What I would add to that is that it's the ability for Puar and Oolong to be disintegrated that allows them to slip out of the ego's grasp.
Yeah, I mean, think of a jester, right? A fool who is able to step outside of the confines of what it means to be a loyal subject to a hierarchy, right? And say things that you couldn't say otherwise, right? And that's what's happening here with the fool preceding the hero. That the fool needs to be able to speak that truth to power that then makes it real, makes it meta real so that it can be acted upon, right?
And to confront the dragon and get the gold. And what is Oolong's gold here?
It's Bulma's panties. Specifically in the Japanese, it's Bulma's panties. In the English, he says the world's most comfortable underwear or something, which is not canon. That's not real.
No. Some of the things in the Japanese need to be read. We just need another dub. 5 million dubs later, and not a dub for Berserk.
Yeah, so we had talked a little bit about the crown, right? The crown that Joffrey wears, the crown that the antagonistic fools were wearing. Well, the positive fool character in this sort of archetypal layout gets the crown here, and his crown is Bulma's panties. I think that this ties back into what I was saying before, where Oolong's manifestation in the world is a reflection of the fact that Bulma becomes aware of the removal of what the panties represent, right? Her claim to that modesty.
Well, and in the end here, by Oolong conquering his fear, he has become kind of a guardian of female modesty, which is a very large transition from where we saw him in, let's say, the first episode.
Right, and this carries over into the next season with Oolong starting to play a more protective role, I suppose you could say, towards Bulma. But specifically too,
they're developing a less pathological relationship.
Right,
it's a step in the right direction too, for Oolong to not only, because we saw last episode him return having the ability to escape, but here stepping up to the plate and actually saving the day in the spirit of the feminine modesty which he gains.
And that's really a huge theme of the first season, that what is happening with that, right? We see it with the introduction of Bulma and her interactions with Roshi, and we see it with Yamcha and Puar and what Yamcha thinks of it. We see that with Midnight Callers. We see the interface with the feminine carrying over further beyond that. We have Chi-Chi introduced in this season. And so all of these expressions of that idea of respecting the feminine and having it play the rightful role that it needs to play within a
but also denigrating and punishing
framework.
the feminine when it behaves toxically, let's say.
When it's not on the path, right? Mm-hmm. And talking about where that universality is between the masculine and feminine. But yeah, so that it makes perfect sense then that if what Oolong's character tries to do good, this is the good expression. This is the good mode for Oolong to be in, which is the returning of that modesty to the feminine. Wanting to bring that back. And so as a heroic action, that's what manifests from him.
Right, and it is able to manifest because of the journey they've been on, which leads us to their integration. Let's say they become, both of them, Puar and Oolong both become more integrated after this episode. But right now, they've even taken steps to become more integrated here. And I wanted to put the waifu Ray and the body pillow because that is the idea of feminine that Puar represents. And then we have, not really what Oolong represents, but what Bluma is seeking and what Oolong severely is not.
Right. We have two representations here of the critical flaw of hyper elevating the traits of the opposite sex, right? And being obsessive about it in the way that, we've been calling Oolong a simp, right? But I think the movie Donjon illustrates this idea as well. It's one that a lot of people haven't seen, but this correlation between, how, let's say, men are obsessed with porn, or young men these days are obsessed with like anime waifus and hentai and all of that shit. On the flip side, you then have the obsession of the feminine over these meta hyper real masculine characters who embody these really generic roles, you could say, in like rom-com movies and romance novels. So there's this opposite unreal sort of interpretation of an obsession that it has a degenerative nature that it plays, right? And that it's not fully integrated.
And I think the reason too that I wanted to bring it up is because Puar and Oolong here escape and are trying to run from Pilaf there, but their disintegration allows them to just be captured like the rest. But we'll get to that point. I also wanted to point out the nature here and if the integration was solid, they actually wouldn't have been able to stop the Fool, because the Fool here, Oolong, defeats the Fool here, Pilaf.
Yeah, the dichotomy between the two, where you have the positive Fool speaking truth to power, and we have the impish negative Fool whose sense of ego is so grand that it's disconnected from the self.
Yes.
And he cannot speak his wish, right? And that's why he can't, right? We have a sequence of him sitting there, and in his imagined empire that he creates for himself, there's all these women bowing down to him, right? See, Ray. And he's just like, yes, I'm the emperor. I am Emperor Pilaf. And then when it comes to speaking that wish, he has nothing to say, right? He's so disconnected from himself that he can't even think of how he would set the boundaries of what that would mean, right?
Well, also to say that his disintegration is more severe than theirs.
Right. It is a very immature nature that he's stuck in right now.
Right. And from there, we're going to get to Pilaf's reaction. So finally, Pilaf's been deceptive and arrogant the entire time, believing that he deserves the Dragon Balls and that he would be a good ruler, despite the fact that there's no evidence to point to that. But now that his opportunity has been taken away from him, he resorts to a more malevolent spirit, let's say, and that's what these pictures here are to represent.
I love that we are going to Cain and Abel for this, because there are multiple elements of this that line up. The first one that I want to say is we should talk a bit about sacrifice, because what happens is that they both make sacrifices to God, and Abel's sacrifice is accepted and Cain's is not, right? So what that represents itself as in Dragon Ball, the sacrifice is the effort to gather the Dragon Balls, right? The way that you go about doing it. And that's why being dishonest and stealing the Dragon Balls, let's say, is not an accepted sacrifice. And part of why thematically Pilaf doesn't get his wish, right? That is his sacrifice not being accepted. And so, of course, in the story, Cain is resentful of that, and he says, then I will kill Abel. I will destroy then. I will then be antagonistic because I reject the system.
Not just the system, but the ideal.
Right.
So it's not just because it is Pilaf saying that now this is destroyed. I can take my revenge. Right. It's a purely resentful attitude, completing that unholy trinity, and it is destroying the ideal because they bested him.
They beat him at his own game.
You've been bested by my pig.
Right. His downfall was his own foolish nature manifest in Oolong, also being able to sneak in there and steal the wish back from him, right?
And unable to face that also is contributing towards the spirit which he adopts here. And so we have these two quotes as well. And this kind of, actually, it's funny because it comes from the Bible and then Shakespeare and then pretty contemporary fact. And so the malice that Pilaf now adopts is he is able to pervert not only the ego, which he's already built a castle out of, and play, which he's already made them experience his version of sadistic play, but he's now able to pervert nature itself and use the dogs. Well, Shu is able to call the dogs to chase the crew down, and Goku is too tired to really run. And the wolves, which is basically just Yamcha, are unable to compete with the perversion of nature, which is what happened in real life, right? The wolf itself wasn't able to continue its pure bloodline and became what you see in the bottom right-hand corner.
That shiver rat, as I like to call it. Yeah, it's an interesting scenario that they find themselves in because there's this inversion. It's like as soon as they get the wish from him, then it's like he just flips and he's like, "Get them. We are going to kill them and torture them."
You don't really want to kill them before.
Yeah, no. I mean, if you wanted to, they'd be dead. They were unconscious by his hand, and he instead took the balls and wanted to play a game and then wanted to go get his wish because he's a child, right?
Because he's a fool, right? He wasn't actually malicious, but now...
But the malice is now.
The malice has manifested.
And, also the wolves being a manifestation of sort of his ability to be malicious, right? His animalistic drive to...
Well, the dogs, I would say, because the wolves, that's Yamcha.
Well, yeah, not the wolves, the dogs. We have two scales of dogs because we've got whatever Shu is, which seems to be somewhere between the two, right? He's a more like fox-like, domesticated-looking... He almost makes me think of a corgi in a weird way, right?
Yeah, a little bit. I see what you mean.
And so it's not him, right? They call the dogs, right? The idea of dog. So it's like he taps into...
Yeah, the idea of perverted nature subjugated to a malicious will.
Well, it's like, let's say we awaken some masculine aspect of Pilaf. He's going to awaken that through Shu and manifest as a reflection of, his... let's say disintegrated masculine element.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a bunch of just like dogs with red eyes.
And so the dogs eventually overwhelm and capture the crew, and Pilaf sends them to the oven.
Right. So we had the ant magnifying glass before,
but now instead of it just being play, this is a destruction. This isn't like burning ants. This is just destroying this army man for no reason. And on the right or on the left, we have this image of almost a cannibalistic and sadistic ritual of impaling that happened in history. And both of those two, I would say, because the oven is related to food preparation, right? It's almost the consumption of our dragon crew because of Pilaf's resentment.
Right. It's a full-on antagonistic approach, right? It's like, I'm going to declare myself above you in the hierarchy so completely, right, that I can rebuild my ego, right? So I can rebuild my self-image. And so, like, you are the sacrifice now.
I will be nourished by your destruction.
Mm-hmm. So he literally puts them in a room with the sun beaming down on them, right?
Well, the sun not yet, because first we'll have the moon.
Well, the intention of having them cooked by the sun beaming down on them.
True.
But, unfortunately, it's nighttime. And this is sort of what happens whenever you have the forthright, heroic character put into a position of, well, you put them in the corner, right? You put them in the situation where they have to stand on something for the sake of existence itself, for the sake of being, right? And you can't, whenever you try to put a torturous spin on the character of someone who is pure, then the shadow rises up to level the playing field, to sort of recontextualize what the persona is really built on. And so back into that Jungian frame here, right? I had mentioned earlier that I like to tie the castle sort of into the persona because, you know, you've got the egoistic mode of being that Pilaf is playing, right? And around himself, he has built his persona. He's built the edges of his identity, right? The walls around himself that he says, okay, this is me. Like, this is my empire, right? This is my potential empire anyway. And it's this desert castle with what you'll see on top of it there is a satellite dish, right? And Goku is awakened as this representation of the shadow by the moon, a satellite, right?
Right, and I think it's important too to just mention that the moon is both enlightening and ancient. And so Goku seeing it and transforming, and we'll get to why others like Goku transform as well, but specifically Goku here, the moon is enlightening the shadow within Goku to burst forth into the outer world. I don't know if it's based on the survival. I think it might specifically because of the cyclical nature of the ancestral. It's complicated. The ancestral drive of destruction or bestial nature, something like that. It's a very complicated idea. Why it is the moon that transforms Goku.
Well, one thing that I'll say is that the unconscious mind is the part of your brain that regulates your body, right? You think there's a logic to how fast your hair grows. It keeps your heart beating. It keeps your intestines moving. It keeps, all of your different organs behaving the way that they're supposed to, right? Like there's a motivating factor to keeping you working that way, and that's more regulated by your unconscious mind. So the Jungian thought is that your unconscious mind is far more complex than we give it credit for, and that interfacing with it can give us great wisdom into ourselves and patterns around ourselves that would help us understand the world in a more significant and meaningful way.
Right, to recognize one's intentions and integrate the shadow is to become more aligned with your ideal self.
And so you can think of the shadow as the brain of the body, right? So the brain of the body is bestial. It is that physical manifestation of something more automatic, right? You could say, hearkening back to pre-fall, pre-knowledge of good and evil. Because that, we understand that we tie back to a biology of that nature, right? That we weren't always self-conscious beings. So understanding that there's wisdom in your ancestry is tied into that idea, right?
Well, it doesn't look too wise right now, but we'll see about that.
But it being tied into that sort of genealogical, right? That the tale that brings you all the way back to your beginning.
Right, and the reflective nature of the moon as well, because the moon reflects light, right? It's a false sun, and this is a false, let's say, transformation of Goku's, obviously. Not who Goku really is. He destroys the castle, though, because the shadow is more powerful than the ego when unleashed in this method, let's say.
Right, let's say
And that's actually how, the shadow destroys the ego.
Yeah, that is what happens in ego death, you could say. We're returning back to the mushrooms. Whenever people take things like ayahuasca or psilocybin mushrooms, they experience that ego death, right? We call it an ego death because it's sort of the crumbling of the castle. The castle comes down, the persona you've built around yourself has to come down, and then you have the freedom to build again, right?
Well, and it's also to say that the power in one's biology, evolutionary or evolution, ancestry, all of those things is where people can find the strength to overcome ego that possesses them.
Mm-hmm. Well, all you need to know is the life story of one or two of your ancestors, and it will put your life
ego
experience into a perspective that will humble you.
And it pretty much put Pilaf in some perspective. But here we mentioned the phases of the moon. Like I said, the cyclical nature is important too, because it is to say that our evolutionary past is riddled with violence, and nature is red in tooth and claw, and that is not missed on Goku's transformation, I would say.
Right, and you could say the cycles of the moon, there's a dark moon and a bright moon that constantly goes back and forth and back and forth. And I think that's a representation of the...
So why is it the full moon and not the new moon?
What do you mean?
In which men are said to transform into beasts.
That is whenever the most enlightenment is reflected to us by the moon. Whereas,
so enlightenment makes men turn into beasts?
Well, the most resonant with the enlightenment from the unconscious mind.
Right, I would say it is that, is the kind of the, and it's because the moon is reflective, it's kind of the false enlightenment that one can relish in.
And
the chaos.
Well, too. The shadow also being a representative of all of the things about you that you cast aside as not worthy of being part of society, right? Anything that's a negative aspect, you could say you put it into a file folder that says like, oh, okay, this thing that I did, not good for society. This is bestial in nature, right? Uncivilized. And you build a shadow out of that. And the shadow literally is that. It is the negative aspect that you think is tied into your bestial nature, right? And so all of that potentiality that you've seen in yourself to be bestial, to be outside of the realm of, let's say, the castle, right? Bigger than the castle. All of your potentiality can come rushing out and just break right out of that castle. If you are in the pressure cooker, if you have to defend yourself, right? If you have to set the scale so that I don't know what I want to say for so that, right? But when the balance needs to be reset, right? That is how it can manifest itself. And Peterson talks about that being tied to the knowledge that, let's say, if you were in World War II Germany, that you would probably be an Auschwitz-style guard, right?
Right. It's the knowledge that the evil other people commit.
Right. That you learn from ancestry too. You learn from looking back into previous generations and seeing how close you are to the ability to commit any form of action that goes well beyond the confines of your inherited identity, let's say, like with a castle.
And you could say too that this idea is explored in some contemporary media, and the idea, let's say Bloodborne, that the insight is what actually insight negatively affects beasthood. Never mind. And it's pretty complicated with Bloodborne. It's pretty complicated with Bloodborne, actually.
Well, I do have an example of contemporary media showing this idea as well. I have a verse from a Tool song, Reflection, right? So we were just talking about the reflection of light from the moon. And Tool is actually very interested in these sort of hermetic traditions and these more alchemical representations of things, right? And so this verse in Reflection says, "In my darkest moment, fetal and weeping, the moon tells me a secret, a confidant. As full and bright as I am, this light is not my own, and a million light reflections pass over me. The source is bright and endless. She resuscitates the hopeless. Without her, we are lifeless satellites drifting, And as I pull my head out, I am without one doubt. Don't want to be down here soothing my narcissism. I must crucify the ego before it's far too late. I pray the light lifts me out, right? So there's a very similar motif going on here in this song, talking about the million light reflections, harkening back to that ancestral wisdom in the moon, right, that we see, and talking about crucifying the ego, calling down into that to come against the ego.
That no matter where you are on Earth, your ancestors also looked up at the moon.
Right.
And here, I do want to mention quickly before we move on, the illustration on the right is to say that those who have unintegrated shadows have the propensity to end up destroying that which is most precious to society, being children.
Right, and there's that aspect of Uzeru that doesn't determine if anything is good or bad before attacking it. It lashes out in all directions.
It's not good or evil. The Uzeru form is not evil.
Right.
It's not good. It's bestial. But yeah, let's go ahead and move on here. So, return to Monkey and the conquering of beasthood here in this Sargon of Akkad conquering a lion. We have the, let's say, pre-fall man here with the, I guess this is an Australopithecus. What is this?
I don't know.
I guess it's
you would know better than me.
Right, and then we have that motif of the consumption again down there, and again with the reverence for one's ancestors there in the Caesar's Hall, the Hall of Caesars.
Right, the Hall of Busts, the Hall of Faces of your ancestry, right? The Roman tradition of really taking the faces of your ancestry seriously and respecting it and holding it as a high regard from a young age. And I would say that's something that we have deviated far, far from now.
Right, and it's a confrontation as well with the idea of mastering that bestial form. And we're going to see that iteration later on in the series. But just to touch on it now, just know that it's not, I don't want to say it's just ancestry. It's kind of more specific than that. It's both biology, evolution, ancestry, the
physiology,
your or let's say one's connection to the celestial. So all of the people on Earth having particles of stars within them, right? That's an idea of it as well. Because really the reason Goku can do this is because he has a celestial origin.
Right. He's super personal. He's sort of extra personal in that way, where he represents he participates in representing that potentiality, right?
Right. And simply because there were horrible things like in this picture at the bottom done in the past by one's ancestors doesn't mean the reverence is unwarranted. And so the reverence, even still, for the Caesars is still there. And we as a society have decided to collect the busts even today, the ones that have survived.
Mm-hmm.
However, Goku does destroy the castle. The castle of ego is gone as we know it.
Right, so Puar points to the moon for Goku. Goku sees the moon, transforms into a Zero, destroys the castle, and clashes with Pilaf.
And Pilaf is defeated.
Yeah.
And his castle wrecked and everything done. He still decides to run away and continue to act as an emperor. Instead of humbling himself to the fact that his ego should be shattered, he continues to wear it as armor, which is why I'm so glad that you inserted this picture of Loki here, because it's such a good one.
Yeah, I mean, it's great, too, because there's this nature. Whenever he's defeated, ultimately, and he's running away, I think he hands Shu a gun, and he says, shoot them with this, and runs away. And it's, if anything shows that he did not learn from having his ego torn down, I think it's that. right?
Mm-hmm.
Because
it's a perfect encapsulation.
I know it'll date us, but this is the same thing that Ethan Klein just did, which was like, stand on your merit. Okay, you shoot him for me, and runs away. Right.
Right. Exactly.
That childish fool mentality.
Well, and it's true because think about what Loki does in this is that he gets the army of the aliens to come fight the battle for him, and Joffrey here fails to learn his lesson after the riot. Right, these are both examples of similar situations.
Mm-hmm.
But he's gone. This is the last we'll see of Pilaf for a bit.
Well, I also want to point out here in this image that Pilaf's got the 1-star ball on his forehead, right? And so, since we're addressing the symbology also, we have the same thing on all of their heads, right? Golden circle. We got the golden circle broken in half, pointing back at Loki, because just look at Loki. We've got, the crown on Joffrey, and I think there's another representation that has a crown on Pilaf, and it's got a 1-star ball on it as well. And it's this inversion of what's going on with Oolong, right? Because we were talking about Oolong gets the panties and wears it as a crown, right? Well, Pilaf's crown is all focused on
power,
the totality of power toward one point, right? And the consolidation of power, the self, right? Being egocentric and saying that by my power, my character is strengthened, right? So that's his crown. So I just wanted to point that out as well.
Yeah, we've talked about that previously. And so as the dragon crew escapes, Bluma gets injured here, and Oolong already has those panties on as the crown, and he goes to help her. And now the reason I have these other ones here, so I have the tortoise and the hare. Obviously, that story is the tortoise wins the race because he persists at it instead of, let's say, getting distracted or failing to do his moral obligation. Where here we have Yamcha, who looks smaller than Oolong in this picture. He fails to help Bluma because he has failed to confront his own failings here. And we see there at the top too, Oolong is more like Clubber Lang, Mr. T in Rocky 3, and Yamcha's more like Rocky. He's not as persistent at growth in this season, and we've seen that too because Oolong consistently has had episodes of growth pretty much since he's been incepted into the show.
Right, and this is coming on the heels of the situation with Oolong getting his wish and putting that claim to modesty on as a crown, right? So now he, like we had said, he's going to be more protective of Bulma. He's going to be more of a he's playing more of a utilitarian role, right? He's more substantial. Whereas we just saw what happened with Boss Rabbit, and he was completely insubstantial. So this is putting Yamcha in his place. This is saying that the speaking of truth to power by the fool is more powerful than your neurotic behavior. And you are of less utility to Bulma than her own ability to pick herself up with her own masculine spirit.
Right, and that cannot persist if Yamcha and Bluma are going to grow together, which we'll see if they do. Because first Yamcha has to save her from the shadow.
Right, save her from the beast of the unconscious, right? Save her from
being consumed specifically by the beast of the unconscious, right?
Right. And you can say slipping into a state of consistently not being conscious, right?
Right, which is why we have Sleeping Beauty here. And in the top right, we have the Wizard of Oz, where the three elements of the Logos have to go rescue Dorothy from the castle. It's a very similar idea here that Yamcha has to rescue Bluma from this beast.
Well, the more operative element also in The Wizard of Oz is that Dorothy's not conscious, right? She's being rescued from unconsciousness by figuring out the magic words.
Oh, well, yeah, that's later, yeah.
But
she's brought to consciousness by the Logos is why I brought that up. And here, Yamcha represents the Logos in the dichotomy between Bulma and Yamcha, just to make that clear.
Right, and this is because her her understanding of the logos needs to transcend Oolong. We need to get past that so that we can overcome what the castle represented, right?
Right.
That toxic persona.
And so we see that even with Yamcha's unintegrated logos, his pure will is unable to break the tail, which manifests Goku's transformation.
Well,
And it is I think the reason I put this Romeo and Juliet is because it's an unfulfilled, unrequited, unmatured infatuation right now between Yamcha and Bulma. It's not something as substantial that could, because there are modes of being which two people can inhabit that are more powerful or can transcend the limits of one's biology and ancestry. This ain't it.
Right. Well, what happens here also, it ties a little bit into Romeo and Juliet in that when Goku turns into Uzeru and breaks the castle all apart, a piece of the castle pins Bulma down, and she's trapped under the castle. And then Yamcha has to go rescue her from being trapped in this debris of the castle, right? And then seeing that he can manipulate the castle, then says, okay, well, I can go cut Goku's tail, and he cuts up a piece of the castle into a sword, a stone sword built out of the castle.
Yeah, that's another part of it. Yeah.
And goes and tries to cut the tail, and it's not strong enough.
The sword of ego is not strong enough, right?
So crafted out of that ego that he had to grapple with in order to interface with Bulma, right? And so tied into the idea of being trapped in a castle, right? You know.
And so that is not going to be able to do it, but what does tame the beast is the feminine spirit, and that's why Puar is able to cut the tail here. And we have Beauty and the Beast there for obvious reasons, because that is what tames the beast in that film is Belle's femininity. And then I got this fan fiction pic of Antigone and Haman, because in that play it is Antigone's feminine spirit which inspires Haman to do the actions he does. I won't spoil it. I don't think Bob's read that play in a long time.
I have not.
Yeah. But it's a similar idea.
Yeah, it's great too, because the setup here is that, yes, Yamcha can approach this, but not with something exterior. It has to be an aspect of his own unconscious, right? And that sort of anima projection being the through line that can actually overcome this and can rescue Bulma from unconsciousness. It's the wisdom, you could say, from Puar and from the existence of Puar, right?
And
integrating the wisdom of Puar.
The reverence for the dignity of the female spirit, which has been boosted and bolstered this entire episode.
Right. It's been about, you're not doing this, Yamcha, right? Oolong is doing it. You're not. And he wins this whole confrontation, you could say, right? He overcomes the real challenge by learning what he needs to from the Fool and becoming his own hero in the story.
And that's what brings them together, and we'll see the consequences of that next episode. But I think that brings us really to the end, because all we have left is sleeping baby Goku.
We sleep in Goku. So that this is... after he's had his tail chopped off, he returns to an unconscious child.
Yes, and so really to recap, what we've seen is different explorations of the Fool's malevolence. We've seen the destruction of the Fool's ego by the shadow of our hero. We've seen the growth of Yamcha into a more, let's say, logos inhabited spirit than before. He's able to conquer the ego later on because of the Fool, Oolong, who's able to overcome his shortcomings, his cowardice, to be able to manifest a wish before Pilaf. And finally, we see Puar able to cut Goku's tail and transform him back into this because of the female spirit that she embodies.
Right. So now we can see the themes of all of season 1 coming together to the place where we need to put the feminine and the masculine in their proper places. We need to put the reverence for ancestry and the reverence for, I should say, straightforward modes of being, right? The theme that we need to be able to put those in the hierarchy where they belong so that we can even begin to comprehend the more mythological aspects of the show.
Because we've just started.
Like we had said before, this is kind of the genesis of Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. And so
a lot of analysis stems from this first season because it's the origin, so it's obviously going to build upon itself. But do you have anything you would like to add, Brock?
No, I think we were pretty thorough with that one. This was definitely a longer one, but I think we actually got through it faster than I thought we were going to. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, it was about an hour and 15. Well, if you liked what you heard, please subscribe, leave us a like, ring the bell for notifications. Remember, I'm your host on the left, Owl.
I'm your host on the right, Brok.
And this was Myth and Meaning, episode 13, Sleeping Goku in Ego's Castle. We hope to see you guys again soon.